It wasn't the growl that shocked the townspeople, but what the old lion was carrying in his mouth. He wasn't snarling. He wasn't attacking. He was waiting like someone on an errand. And what happened next left even the bravest hearts trembling. The sun had barely crept over the edge of the savannah, spilling a golden light across the dusty streets of a rural town skirting the edge of the Mbanga Wildlife Reserve. It was a quiet morning. Roosters crowed in the distance, shop shutters clanged open, and sleepy children rubbed their eyes as they followed their parents to market. Then came the silence. Not the usual morning calm, but a dead silence. Even the birds stopped chirping. That's when shopkeeper Nality looked up and dropped her tea. Across the street, right in front of her small provision store, stood an old, battered lion. His mane was gray with age, his ribs visible through his golden coat. He had a limp in his back leg. But it wasn't just his appearance that made everyone freeze. It was the tiny, terrified cub dangling gently from his mouth. "He's carrying a baby," someone screamed. But it wasn't a human child, it was a lion cub. Barely a few weeks old. Fragile. Dirty. Breathing just barely. The old lion didn't move. He didn't roar. He didn't snarl. He placed the cub softly on the ground right in front of the store's entrance, then stepped back, staring straight at Nality through the glass. Her hands shook. She didn't know whether to run or call for help. But the lion just stood there, pawing at the dirt softly, almost pleading. A crowd began to gather. Some ran. Others watched from behind fences or from the rooftops. A few brave or foolish ones recorded on their phones, whispering theories. What if it escaped from the reserve? Why would it bring a cub here? Is it hungry? Then someone shouted, "Call Ranger Tabo." Ranger Tabo Nguyen had seen a lot in his 20 years at Mbanga Reserve. Snare rescues, rogue leopards, illegal hunters. But when his phone buzzed that morning with a trembling voice saying, "There's a lion at the market," he thought it was a joke. Until he saw the video. 5 minutes later he was tearing through the reserve gates in his truck, lights flashing. He didn't stop at headquarters. He didn't even wait for backup. Something in the lion's eyes, something unusual, compelled him to act fast. The old lion was still there when Tabo arrived, crouched now, breathing heavily. The cub hadn't moved. Its little body looked limp and cold. Tabo's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He stepped out slowly, unarmed, voice calm. "Easy boy. I'm not here to fight you." The lion blinked at him. Tabo could see the exhaustion etched into every inch of the animal's body. But more than that, he saw fear. Not aggression. Fear. It was then that something extraordinary happened. The lion nudged the cub forward with his nose and looked directly at Tabo. Then, almost as if he had fulfilled his purpose, the lion turned and began limping away. But after only a few steps he collapsed. People gasped. Tabo dropped to the cub first. It was barely breathing. Flies hovered around its fur. It had an infected gash near its belly. Malnourished. Dehydrated. Left untreated, it wouldn't survive the day. But Tabo had seen this kind of damage before. A snare wound. The cub had been trapped, and somehow the old lion had gotten it free. But who was he? Where was the mother? Why had he brought the cub here to people? And what had it cost him? Tabo called for the wildlife vet team and cradled the cub in his arms, whispering, "Stay with me, little one." The old lion was breathing, barely. His body was riddled with old scars, fresh cuts, ticks, and muscle wasting. He looked like a survivor of 100 battles. But even in his broken state, he had guarded the cub with every last ounce of strength. "We need to get them both to the sanctuary. Now." Inside the rescue van, the cub whimpered as the vet team cleaned its wounds. The old lion didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the cub, even as they inserted an IV into his leg. "He's her guardian," the vet said quietly. "Maybe not her father. But he chose to protect her." It didn't make sense. Male lions weren't supposed to care for cubs, not like this. Not with such desperation. Something was different here. Hours later, at the reserve's emergency care unit, Tabo stood outside the glass observation room. The cub was wrapped in warm blankets, fighting for life. The old lion was sedated, tubes running from his frail body. A volunteer named Amelie stood beside Tabo, watching in awe. "You ever seen anything like this before?" she asked. Tabo shook his head. "No. And I don't think anyone has." But that night, when Tabo reviewed the camera traps near the reserve border, his blood ran cold. He saw poachers. Traps. Chaos. He saw the old lion dragging something from the mud, licking it frantically. He saw other lions fleeing in panic. And he saw something he never expected. The old lion carrying the cub in his mouth, limping through the wilderness for miles. right toward the village, toward the humans. Because somehow, he knew it was the only place left to get help. The footage wouldn't stop replaying in Ranger Tabo's mind. He sat in the dim security room of the Mabanga Wildlife Sanctuary, eyes locked on the monitor as the looped video showed the old lion limping through dense brush, a tiny cub dangling gently from his jaws. Each frame told a story of pain, resilience, and something deeper, an instinct not taught by nature but forged in suffering. Why had the lion chosen to trust humans? Why did he walk miles with his wounded body, only to place the cub gently in front of a shop like he knew it would be safe? As Tabo zoomed into the timestamp, he saw that the lion had begun his trek the previous evening, traveling nearly 12 hours straight. No stops. No food. Just purpose. "We need to go back to where he came from," Tabo said suddenly, his voice firm. "We need to know what happened out there." Amelie, who had been silently reviewing the cub's medical chart beside him, looked up. "You think there's more?" "I know there is," he said. "This isn't just a rescue. This lion, he came to deliver a message." By dawn, Tabo and a small rescue team set out, following the lion's exact route as tracked on the cameras. They carried medical supplies, tranquilizer equipment just in case, and satellite radios. The sanctuary's drone hovered overhead, scanning the savanna. It didn't take long to find the signs. Just beyond the sanctuary's outer range, where the protected zone faded into open wilderness, lay the remnants of a recent struggle. Blood in the dirt. Deep claw marks in the bark of a nearby acacia tree. A smashed snare trap glinting beneath a thorn bush. And drag marks. "Something was caught here," one ranger said. "And something else tried to free it." "Look," Amelie whispered. Half buried in the mud was a second snare, smaller, with a torn clump of lion cub fur still tangled in the metal. That cub had been trapped. But there was something else. Just a few yards away, Tabo noticed a strange mound of dirt. Freshly disturbed. He motioned for the others to help him dig. Moments later, their hands froze. Buried beneath the soil were bones, small ones. A second cub. Dead. A litter mate. "No," Amelie gasped. Tabo stood silently, jaw clenched. The old lion hadn't saved just any cub. He tried to save both. Something, poachers, a fight, maybe both, had forced the mother away or killed her. The cubs were left behind and he had returned for them. A male lion. Risking his life for another's young. They continued deeper into the wild. More signs began to surface. Scattered remains of a campfire, cigarette butts, even a torn plastic bag with meat wrappings. The kind used by bushmeat traffickers. They had been here recently and they weren't far. "Trap lines run all the way through this area," Tabo said, surveying the terrain. "If it weren't for that lion, no one would have known. And if the cub hadn't survived," Amelie added, "no one would have believed it." Back at the sanctuary, the old lion still hadn't woken. The vet had stabilized him, but his body was dangerously weak. His kidneys were failing. He had a history of multiple untreated infections, old arrow wounds, and injuries consistent with beatings, likely from previous encounters with poachers. "We scanned his ear," the vet said when Tabo returned. "He's not tagged. Not registered. He's wild. Or was. And the cub. She's improving. Fever's down. She's strong considering what she's been through. We're calling her Nia. Meaning purpose in Swahili. Fitting." That evening, Tabo sat beside the old lion's enclosure, watching the sun dip behind the acacias. He had ordered a perimeter lockdown, too many signs of poacher activity. They were getting bolder. But tonight his thoughts weren't on safety. They were on him. "Who were you?" Tabo whispered. Just then the lion stirred. It was subtle at first, a twitch of his paw. Then a blink. And finally, with a slow groan, he lifted his head. His eyes scanned the room, and when he saw Tabo there was no fear. No fight. Just recognition. Almost as if he remembered the face that had cradled the cub. Tabo approached slowly, holding a photo in his hand. It was taken from the camera trap years ago, an image of a female lioness, nursing two cubs in the outer territories. In the background, barely visible, was a male lion watching from a distance. Older. Gray mane. Same scar over the left eye. "It was you," Tabo murmured. The lion blinked once. That lioness had disappeared 6 months ago. Assumed dead. But now the pieces were clear. He had stayed behind. Raised the cubs. Fought for them. And when danger came he didn't run. He carried one to safety. That night, Nia, still weak but responsive, was brought in a small crate to the lion's recovery pen. The vet placed her gently on a blanket nearby. The old lion lifted his head, let out a soft huff. Nia stirred. Then miraculously she dragged herself toward him, her tiny paws weak, legs shaky. But she made it. Crawled close until she was pressed against his chest. And there she slept. The lion's breathing slowed. A soft, contented sigh escaped his lungs. Even in pain he was still protecting her. "They're bonded," Amelie whispered through tears. "That's not just biology. That's love." Tabo nodded, eyes glassy. "From this day forward," he said, "they both have a name. He's no longer just a number. We'll call him Baba. Father." But as the sanctuary settled into silence, a message came through the ranger radio. "We found more snares," the voice crackled. "North of the camp. Looks like they were set last night. They're still fresh." Tabo's jaw tightened. It wasn't over. Whoever had done this was still out there. Still hunting. And Baba had just become the symbol of something bigger. A battle for every lion on the fringe. The night was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. Ranger Tabo stood atop the sanctuary's watchtower, scanning the tree line with a pair of infrared binoculars. Every rustle, every shift in the wind made his jaw clench tighter. There had been 3 new snares found that day, close to the northern perimeter, almost inside protected grounds. These poachers weren't just sloppy. They were sending a message. And that message was clear: we're coming back. Back for what though? Tabo's gut knew the answer before he could even admit it aloud. They wanted Nia. Back in the emergency enclosure, Nia was fast asleep, nestled against Baba's weakened frame. The old lion was still barely eating, but his eyes followed her every move. She had started gaining strength, lifting her head more, mewling softly for milk, even nibbling at the wet meat puree the vet smeared onto her paws. "She's healing," Amelie said, sitting beside the enclosure. "But it's not just the medicine. It's him." Tabo nodded slowly. "He gives her something the rest of us can't, security." Amelie looked over at Baba's sunken eyes and scarred body. "But how much longer can he keep giving?" Tabo didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew Baba was fading. The next morning, the team flew a drone back out toward the site of the poacher activity. Tabo personally reviewed the footage, and what he saw turned his stomach. Tents, tools, meat hooks, wire traps. 2 men crouched beside a portable cooler, flipping through a wrinkled booklet. Tabo zoomed in. The pages were covered in photos of lion cubs, cataloged, numbered, priced. They were selling them. Lion cubs. Taken from the wild, sold as exotic pets or worse. Used in can hunting setups or trafficked to private collectors overseas. It was a growing black market, and now Tabo knew for sure, Baba hadn't just rescued Nia from death. He had rescued her from slavery. By the afternoon, Tabo had coordinated with regional wildlife law enforcement. A sting operation was forming, but the window was closing fast. "These men are mobile," Officer Lindayo, the regional anti-poaching unit commander, told him over the radio. "We wait too long, they vanish. We strike too soon, we risk losing the whole network." Tabo didn't have the luxury of delay. "If they get close to this sanctuary again, they'll take her. We won't let that happen." "You don't know how bold they are," Tabo snapped. "Baba walked 12 hours across hostile terrain with a cub in his mouth because we're the last hope left. We can't let her down." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We move at sunrise." Back at the sanctuary, Tabo sat alone with Baba while the vet checked his vitals. The old lion was visibly weaker now. His breathing slower. His eyes dull. "Do you think he knows what he did?" Emily asked. Tabo looked over. "Not in the way we do. But he felt it. He knew that cub needed someone. That no one else would come. So he chose to become something no one expected." Emily smiled faintly. "He became her father." That night, something unexpected happened. Baba stood. Slowly, trembling but steady. Nia was curled at his paws when he rose. The vet reached for a sedative, but Tabo raised his hand. "Wait." Baba turned toward the viewing window. For a moment he just stared at the glass. Then with effort he let out a long, low roar. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Through the enclosure, through the night, through every heart on the sanctuary grounds. It was the first sound he'd made since arriving. It wasn't a cry of pain. It wasn't anger. It was a call. A call of defiance. At dawn, the sting operation launched. Tabo, Lindayo, and a dozen rangers converged on the poacher camp in coordinated silence. The drone circled overhead as armed officers crept in from 3 sides. A single hawk's cry broke the stillness, and the raid began. Shouts. Scrambling. A chase through underbrush. When it was over, 4 men were in custody. 3 others escaped into the trees, but the campsite was dismantled. Weapons, traps, and documents were seized. Most disturbing of all were the contents of a white cooler found buried in the dirt. 3 lion cub tracking collars. Bloody. Cut clean off. Tabo stared at them and whispered, "They were tagged cubs, already rescued once." They found them again. It was a horrifying revelation. The poachers weren't just taking from the wild. They were stealing from sanctuaries too. Back at the Mabanga Wildlife Sanctuary, Tabo addressed his team. "This is not just about Baba and Nia anymore. This is a war for every animal that's ever been given a second chance." He paused, voice thick. "That lion reminded us who we are. What we're fighting for. So from this day forward, no more quiet tolerance. We hunt the hunters." Baba's condition worsened by the hour. The vet's prognosis was grim: renal failure, a collapsed lung, and irreversible joint decay from untreated infections. "We can keep him comfortable," she said gently. "But he doesn't have long." Amelie leaned in against the enclosure fence, watching as Nia licked Baba's nose gently. He didn't move, but a slow exhale blew through his nostrils. Still aware. Still present. Still holding on. "For her," Tabo murmured. "He's holding on for her." That evening, a regional news crew arrived to cover the raid and Baba's story. The footage went viral in under 24 hours. People across the country wept at the sight of the old lion carrying the cub to safety. Animal rights groups reached out. Donations poured in. And suddenly the story of one old, battered lion and a single orphaned cub became a global cry for change. But deep in the sanctuary, away from the cameras, the real story continued. As night fell, Baba let out one final breath, and didn't take another. He passed silently with Nia curled against him, unaware her protector was gone. When Tabo entered the enclosure and knelt beside him, he felt the weight of something profound. A warrior. A father. A lion who had no reason to trust humans, yet carried a cub into their world, hoping they'd be different. And now, they had to be. The morning light was soft and golden, painting the sky in shades of promise. But inside the sanctuary's quarantine pen, the air was heavy with silence. Baba's body had been wrapped in a shroud of woven fabric, his great mane now motionless, his eyes closed forever. Nia, still unaware of the loss she had just suffered, pawed gently at his flank. She let out a faint cry, expecting the warmth of a breath, the low rumble of reassurance she'd known since birth. But none came. Amelie was the first to kneel beside her. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks as she reached into the pen. Nia turned, confused but not frightened. She pressed her small head into Amelie's hand. "She doesn't know," Amelie whispered, her voice barely audible. "She still thinks he's just sleeping." Tabo stood at the threshold, fists clenched at his sides. He hadn't spoken since the vet confirmed it. Baba was gone. Not tranquilized. Not sedated. Gone. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that day, the sanctuary staff gathered beneath the large baobab tree at the edge of the compound, the place where generations of rescued animals had been laid to rest. But Baba wasn't just any animal. He was a legend now. Tabo stood before the team, the crowd of press and supporters held back by a respectful distance. The camera crew stayed silent as the rangers lowered the body into the ground, wrapped in woven leaves and marked by a single carved stone. "He didn't ask for any of this," Tabo began, his voice rough. "He wasn't tamed. He wasn't trained. He was a wild lion. And still, he chose to trust us." His eyes fell to Nia, curled in Amelie's arms. "He carried her to our doorstep, because something in him still believed we could do better. And that belief, it's now our duty to prove it right." He looked up, tears caught in his lashes. He wasn't just her protector. He was our wake-up call. The crowd was silent. Only the wind moved through the trees. And then, a small sound. A cub's cry. Nia let out a soft, searching mewl from Amelie's arms, as if calling to her father. The crowd broke. Everyone wept. In the weeks that followed, Nia's recovery became the sanctuary's beating heart. But she wasn't just healing physically, she was being shaped by Baba's memory. Tabo made sure of it. He installed a large mural of Baba on the wall outside the education center. A lifelike painting showing the lion limping toward the shop, Nia in his jaws, eyes determined. Beneath it, in bold, hand-carved lettering. He carried hope on his back. Let us carry it now. Tourists came from across the world to hear the story. Schools brought children to learn about animal rescue. Donations surged. New fencing was installed, new rangers were hired, and most importantly, a full-time anti-poaching task force was launched under the name Project Baba. No trap would go unnoticed again. But Nia, she needed more than cameras and funding. She needed a family. "You can't raise a lion alone," Emily told Tabo one evening as they watched her play in the rehabilitation enclosure. "She needs others. Role models. Companions." Tabo nodded slowly. "There's a juvenile pride in the Eastern Range. They've accepted orphans before. If she bonds, they'll protect her. But it has to be her choice. We won't force anything. We'll let her lead." The day Nia was introduced to the juvenile pride, every ranger held their breath. She was small, quiet, still learning to trust the world again. But as the pride approached, 4 lions all under 4 years old, Nia stood still, ears up, tail twitching. And then, something incredible happened. The young lioness at the front crouched down, letting out a low, friendly chuff. Nia answered with a tiny chirp. She ran straight to the lioness. Within minutes she was nestled among them, licked, sniffed, accepted. No aggression. No rejection. It was as if they knew. As if the wild itself had whispered Baba's story to them, and they opened their hearts without hesitation. Over the next few months, Nia thrived. She grew fast, stronger every week. Her play became bolder, her curiosity unstoppable. But even as she bonded with her new pride, she never stopped returning to one spot in the enclosure. The memorial stone at the edge of the baobab. She would lie there quietly sometimes, pressing her face against the cool earth. And always alone. Emily once placed a hidden camera nearby, curious about what Nia did there. When she reviewed the footage, her heart nearly stopped. The little cub sat by the stone. And then she roared. It was still high-pitched, still learning, but it was a roar. A tiny echo of the one Baba had made before he died. She was carrying him forward. Tabo knew it was time. Time to let her go. The wild was where she belonged. Baba hadn't brought her to a cage, he'd brought her to a chance. And now she had to take it. The release took place on the anniversary of Baba's death. Just as the sun began to rise, the eastern gate of the sanctuary opened. The juvenile pride, now fully bonded and healthy, walked cautiously into the dawn. Nia followed behind them. But before she crossed into the wilderness, she stopped, turned, and looked at Tabo. They stared at each other for a long time. No sound, no movement. Then she let out one last soft chuff. As if to say, "I'm ready." She turned and ran into the wild. Months later, camera traps would pick her up again. Hunting, roaming, thriving, leading, and eventually raising. She had cubs of her own. Cubs who would never know Baba, but who would live because of him. And at the edge of the sanctuary, beneath the same baobab tree, new rangers would gather every year to tell her story. To tell his story. Not of death, but of sacrifice. Not of loss, but of hope. If Baba's story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe and be part of a world where even the wildest hearts can trust again. Because every rescue begins with a roar for help. And every hope lives on, in those brave enough to answer.